My brother stole my wedding ring to pawn it for drug money, denying it to my face. I tracked it down and got him arrested. That was 2 months ago. Today, he's begging me to bail him out. Look, I never thought I'd be the type to turn family in. To the cops, you know? Growing up, we had this whole ride or die mentality in our house. Mom always said family comes first, no matter what. But sometimes family pushes you so far that you gotta draw a line in the sand, and brother, did mine ever cross it? So here's the deal. I've been married to my husband for 3 years now, and let me tell you, that wedding ring means everything. To me. It's not some fancy diamond-encrusted piece from Tiffany or anything. We got it at a local jewelry shop for like $800. But man, it represented our whole journey together. We scraped and saved for months just to afford those simple gold bands, working double shifts at our jobs and eating ramen noodles for dinner way too many nights. My brother Jake has always been the wild card in our family. Dude's 26, 2 years younger than me, and he's been bouncing between jobs his whole adult life. Construction 1 month, pizza delivery the next, always chasing some get-rich-quick scheme that never pans out. Our parents bailed him out of tight spots more times than I can count. Car payments, rent money, you name it. They'd always say he just needed to find his path, that he was a good kid deep down. But about a year ago, things got real sketchy real fast. Jake started showing up to family dinners looking rough around the edges, if he showed up at all. Bloodshot, eyes, twitchy behavior, always checking his phone like he was expecting some urgent message. Mom kept making excuses, saying he was just stressed about work, but I knew better. I'd seen enough of my college buddies go down similar roads to recognize the signs. The whole mess started on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd just gotten out of the shower and was getting ready for work when I noticed my jewelry box looked different. You know how you keep your stuff in a certain way? Like, my earrings always go in the top left compartment, necklaces in the middle, and my wedding ring sits in this little velvet slot on the right side when I'm not wearing it. I always take it off before showering because the soap makes it slippery. But that morning, the ring wasn't there. I tore apart my entire bedroom thinking maybe it had fallen behind the dresser or rolled under the bed. Checked the bathroom counter, the kitchen sink, even looked in the washing machine thinking maybe it got caught in some clothes. Nothing. My husband helped me search for like 2 hours before we both had to leave for work. And by then, I was pretty much in full panic mode. That's when I remembered Jake had stopped by the night before while my husband was at his Monday night bowling league. Said he needed to use our bathroom because his apartment's plumbing was acting up again. I'd been doing dishes and told him to go ahead, didn't think much of it. But now, with my ring missing, my stomach dropped like I'd just stepped off a cliff. I called Jake around lunchtime, trying to keep my voice casual, asked if he'd seen my ring anywhere, maybe noticed it on the bathroom counter or something. He got all defensive immediately, which was my first red flag. Started going on about how he couldn't believe I'd even suggest he'd take something, how hurt he was that I'd think so little of him. Classic deflection moves, you know? But I wasn't buying it. Something in his voice sounded off, like when we were kids and he'd deny eating the last cookie while chocolate crumbs were literally stuck to his shirt. Update, holy cow, you guys are amazing with all this support. I'm shaking as I write this next part because honestly, I never expected to be in this situation with my own family. Some of you are asking if I confronted him directly first. Trust me, that's exactly what I did next. But what I discovered made everything so much worse than I imagined. So I decided to do some detective work. Started calling pawn shops around town, describing my ring and asking if anyone had brought in something matching that description. Most places were pretty helpful once I explained the situation, and on my 4th call, I hit the jackpot. This guy at Pete's Pawn and Gold on the east side of town was like, yeah, actually someone came in yesterday with a ring just like that. Young guy, kinda nervous, said it was his grandmother's and he needed quick cash for car repairs. The description he gave me matched Jake perfectly, down to the stupid tribal tattoo on his forearm that he got during his finding myself phase. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest. I asked if the ring was still there, and thankfully the guy said they had a 3-day holding period before putting items out for sale. He agreed to hold it for me while I figured out what to do next. I'll be honest, I sat in my car outside that pawn shop for like 20 minutes just trying to process everything. Part of me wanted to march over to Jake's apartment and demand answers, maybe give him a chance to make things right. But the bigger part of me was just furious. This wasn't some random piece of jewelry, this was my wedding ring, the symbol of my marriage, my commitment to my husband, something that couldn't be replaced even if we bought the exact same ring again. When I got home that evening, my husband took one look at my face and knew something major was up. I told him everything. And man, he was livid. Started pacing around our living room talking about how he'd always known Jake was trouble, how he'd never trusted him around our stuff. I had to calm him down before he stormed over to confront Jake himself. We decided the smart move was to handle this properly through official channels. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. The officer I spoke with was really understanding and said this kind of thing happens more often than people think, especially when drugs are involved. He walked me through the process of filing a report and said they'd need me to identify the ring at the pawn shop before they could proceed. The next morning, I met Officer Rodriguez at Pete's Pawn and Gold. Seeing my ring sitting in that display case with a little white tag showing a price of $400 made me feel sick to my stomach. $400. Jake had sold my wedding ring, something priceless to me, for $400 lousy dollars. The pawn shop owner, Pete, was actually really cool about the whole thing. Showed us the paperwork Jake had filled out, including a photocopy of his driver's license. Everything was documented properly on their end. They'd followed all the legal requirements for accepting pawned items. Pete even said he'd had a weird feeling about the transaction because Jake seemed so nervous and kept changing his story about where the ring came from. Officer Rodriguez took photos of everything and said they'd be paying Jake a visit later that day. He explained that since we had clear evidence of the theft and Jake's identity was confirmed through the pawnshop records, it was pretty much an open and shut case. I went home and tried to go about my normal routine, but honestly, I was a wreck. Kept checking my phone every 5 minutes waiting for updates. Around 3 in the afternoon, Officer Rodriguez called and said they'd arrested Jake at his apartment. Found him with a small amount of what they suspected was heroin, which explained a lot about his recent behavior and desperate need for cash. Update: you guys are asking some tough questions about whether I feel guilty, and honestly, yes and no. What Jake did was wrong, full stop. But seeing him get arrested was one of the hardest things I've ever watched, even though I wasn't there in person. When my mom called me that evening crying, asking how I could do this to my own brother, part of me wondered if I'd made the right choice. But then I remembered holding my wedding ring again, and I knew I had to protect my boundaries. The fallout in my family was intense. Mom and Dad were split right down the middle. Dad understood why I'd pressed charges, but Mom felt like I'd betrayed the family. She kept saying things like, he's sick, he needs help, not jail time, and how could you put your brother behind bars over a piece of jewelry? But here's the thing, it wasn't just about a piece of jewelry. It was about trust, respect, and the fact that Jake had violated our home and stolen something incredibly meaningful to me. If I'd let this slide, what would he steal next? My husband's guitar collection? Our emergency cash stash? The laptop I use for my freelance work? Jake's court date got scheduled for about 6 weeks out. In the meantime, he sat in county lockup because his bail was set at $5,000, and none of us had that kind of money lying around. Mom kept hinting that maybe we could all pool our resources to get him out, but I shut that down real quick. I wasn't about to reward his behavior by helping him avoid the consequences of his actions. During those weeks, I started getting calls from Jake's friends asking me to drop the charges. These sketchy dudes I'd never met before would call at weird hours saying Jake was good people and that family should stick together. One guy even showed up at my workplace asking to talk to me, which was super uncomfortable and made me glad I'd installed those security cameras at our house. The whole situation put a strain on my marriage too, which really ticked me off. My husband was incredibly supportive, don't get me wrong, but dealing with all the family drama was exhausting for both of us. We'd always had this peaceful, stable life together, and suddenly we were dealing with police reports, court dates, and relatives calling at all hours trying to guilt-trip me into changing my mind. When Jake's court date finally arrived, I had to testify about what happened. Seeing him sitting at that defendant's table in his orange jumpsuit was surreal. He looked awful, skinny, pale, like he hadn't slept in weeks. Part of me felt sorry for him, but then I remembered how he'd looked me right in the eye and denied taking my ring, even when I'd given him multiple chances to come clean. The whole proceeding took less than an hour. Jake's public defender tried to argue that this was a family dispute that should be handled privately, but the prosecutor pointed out that theft is theft, regardless of family relationships. The judge agreed and sentenced Jake to 6 months in county jail, plus community service and mandatory drug counseling once he got out. I thought that would be the end of it, that Jake would serve his time and hopefully get the help he needed. My ring was back where it belonged, the legal system had done its job, and maybe this whole nightmare would serve as a wake-up call for him. But apparently, I was being way too optimistic. 2 months into Jake's sentence, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Jake calling from jail, and he sounded different, more desperate, more broken than I'd ever heard him. He started off apologizing, saying he knew what he'd done was wrong and that he was sorry for putting me through all this stress. For a minute there, I thought maybe he'd actually learned something from this experience. Then he got to the real reason for his call. Apparently, Jake had gotten into some kind of trouble inside jail, something about owing money to another inmate for protection or drugs. The details were pretty vague. He said if he didn't come up with $1,500 for bail by the end of the week, things were going to get really bad for him. Started talking about how county jail was different from what he'd expected, how he wasn't cut out for this kind of environment. The whole conversation felt like manipulation central. He kept saying things like, I know I screwed up, but you're the only family I have who might be able to help, and I've learned my lesson. I just need one more chance to prove I can change. Classic addict behavior, hitting all the emotional buttons he thought might work on me. But you know what? I'd done my research during those 6 weeks before his trial. Read up on addiction, talked to a counselor about enabling behaviors, learned about setting healthy boundaries with family members who have substance abuse problems. Every article, every expert, every support group said the same thing. Don't rescue them from the consequences of their actions. So I told Jake, no, not just no, but heck no. I explained that he'd made his choices and now he had to live with them. That I wasn't going to throw good money after bad trying to fix problems he'd created for himself. That maybe spending the full 6 months in jail would give him the time and motivation he needed to get serious about recovery. He did not take it well. Started yelling about how I was a terrible sister, how I'd already ruined his life by pressing charges, and now I was basically sentencing him to get hurt or worse in jail. Said our parents would be ashamed of me for abandoning family when they needed help most. Really laid on the guilt thick, hitting every emotional manipulation tactic. In the book, Update, this is it, the moment I've been dreading to write about. Jake's reaction to my refusal was so intense, so filled with anger and desperation, that it confirmed every decision I'd made up to this point. Some of you predicted he'd try to guilt trip me harder, and wow, were you right. But what happened? Next showed me exactly who my brother had become, and it wasn't someone I recognized anymore. When I wouldn't budge on the bail money, Jake completely lost it on that phone call. Started screaming about how this was all my fault, how he never would have been in this situation if I hadn't snitched on him. Said I was dead to him, that he'd never forgive me for choosing a stupid ring over my own flesh and blood. The call ended with him hanging up on me, but that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few days, I started getting calls from other inmates, collect calls that I had to accept charges for before I realized what was happening. These guys would get on the line and basically threaten me, saying things like Jake was in real danger and it would be my fault if something happened to him. I reported all of this to Officer Rodriguez, who said it was pretty typical behavior for inmates trying to manipulate family members into providing money. He advised me to stop accepting any collect calls from the jail and to document everything in case we needed to file additional charges for harassment. The hardest part was dealing with my parents during all this. Mom was convinced I was being heartless, that I should liquidate my savings account if necessary to help Jake. She kept saying things like, "What if something terrible happens to him in there? How will you live with yourself?" Dad was more supportive of my decision, but even he seemed conflicted about the whole situation. I had to have some really tough conversations with both of them about enabling versus helping, about the difference between supporting someone's recovery and just covering up the consequences of their actions. It was exhausting trying to educate them while also dealing with my own emotions about the whole mess. My husband was my rock through all of this. He never once suggested I should give in to Jake's demands, never made me feel guilty for standing firm on my boundaries. When I'd have moments of doubt, wondering if I was being too harsh, he'd remind me of how Jake had looked me in the eye and lied about stealing my ring. How he'd shown no real remorse until he needed something from me. 3 weeks after that first phone call, Jake tried a different approach. Got another inmate to call me pretending to be a friend from the outside, saying Jake had been beaten up and was in the medical unit. This guy spun this whole elaborate story about how Jake was afraid for his life and needed to get out immediately for his own safety. But I'd learned to verify everything by this point. Called the jail directly and spoke to a supervisor who confirmed that Jake was fine, hadn't been in any fights, and was actually in protective custody by his own request, which was probably why he needed the bail money, since protective custody, inmates often get released earlier if they can make bail. That's when it really hit me how far Jake had fallen. He wasn't just stealing from family anymore. He was orchestrating elaborate deception schemes involving multiple people, all designed to manipulate me into giving him money. This wasn't the brother I'd grown up with, the guy who used to help me with my math homework and taught me how to ride a bike without training wheels. Last week, Jake got released after serving 4 months of his 6-month sentence. Apparently, he'd earned some good behavior credits and qualified for early release with the understanding that he'd complete his community service and drug counseling requirements. I found out about his release not from him, but from my mom, who called to let me know he was staying at their house temporarily. She seemed to expect me to be relieved, maybe even excited that he was out and getting his life back together, but honestly, I felt nothing but anxiety about the whole situation. Jake hasn't called me directly since getting out, but I know he's been asking Mom and Dad about me, wanting to know if I'm still angry, if there's any chance we can work things out and go back to being a family. Mom keeps hinting that maybe it's time to let bygones be bygones, that Jake has learned his lesson and deserves a second chance. The thing is, I'm not against second chances. I believe people can change, can overcome addiction, can rebuild their lives after making serious mistakes. But Jake hasn't actually demonstrated any real change yet. He hasn't apologized for lying to me, hasn't acknowledged the violation of trust that started this whole mess, hasn't shown any understanding of why I pressed charges in the first place. From what Mom tells me, he's got a job lined up at a warehouse and is supposedly attending NA meetings twice a week. That's great, and I genuinely hope he succeeds. But until he takes real accountability for his actions and shows consistent change over time, I'm not ready to welcome him back into my life with open arms. My husband and I have talked extensively about this, and we've decided to maintain our boundaries for now. We've changed our locks, installed a security system, and made it clear to both sets of parents that Jake is not welcome in our home until he's demonstrated sustained sobriety and made genuine amends for what he did. Some people might think I'm being too harsh, holding a grudge over something that happened months ago. But here's what I've learned through this whole experience. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and family loyalty shouldn't come at the expense of your own safety and well-being. Jake made a series of choices that led to this situation. He chose to start using drugs, chose to steal from me, chose to lie about it when confronted, and chose to try manipulating me instead of taking responsibility for his actions. Each of those choices had consequences, and it's not my job to shield him from those consequences just because we share DNA. I'm living my life now with clear boundaries and a renewed appreciation for the people who've stood by me through this whole ordeal. My marriage is stronger than ever. I've got a great relationship with my dad who finally understands why I made the choices I did. And I'm slowly rebuilding trust with my mom as she comes to terms with who Jake really is versus who she wants him to be. My wedding ring sits exactly where it belongs, on my finger, where it represents not just my commitment to my husband, but also my commitment to myself and my own values. I protected something precious to me, stood up for what was right even when it was difficult, and learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive behavior. Jake's out of jail now, and hopefully he's on a path toward real recovery. But whether or not he chooses to walk that path consistently is up to him. I'm not responsible for his choices anymore, and I'm definitely not responsible for rescuing him from the consequences of those choices. For the first time in months, I'm sleeping peacefully at night, knowing I did the right thing even when it was the hardest thing. And that's worth more than all the guilt trips and family drama in the world.